Welcome to Automation Unscripted, an educational, frank, and fun podcast dedicated to the art of business process automation. Automation Unscripted is brought to you by Virtual Operations, a leading consultancy in digital transformation, with more than a decade's experience working with organizations to help them grow their return on investment in automation. In this edition, your hosts, Daniel Andrews and Kieran Gilmuray, are discussing how post-production support works in an automation program, the role of the Robotic Operations Center, and some of the learning pathways for individuals looking to support an automated infrastructure.
Welcome to our first Virtual Operations podcast, where we're going to talk all things intelligent automation. Today, you'll be listening to both myself, Dan Andrews, and Kieran Gilmuray talk about post-production support and the role an ROC, which stands for Robotic Operations Center, plays. First, let's start with some brief intros. My name's Dan. I've been in the space for well over a decade now. For the last 6 years, I've specialized in post-production support, and I would hope that after that long period of time, I'd be fairly knowledgeable on the subject.
Hello, my name is Kieran. I've been in the industry 3 decades, which is kind of scary when you think about it, but looking to share all of the knowledge that we've got, because I'm a firm believer in all boats rise on a floating tide. A bit like Dan, when it comes to automation, I've been working on this, as it's currently called, for the last 10 years, but realistically, there's been workflow automation and everything else before that for 2 decades. So let's bring our knowledge together to help you achieve great things, because we see too many people in the network, I think it's fair to say, Dan, talking about things that they may not have the depth of knowledge on, and customers may spend large quantities of cash that they don't need to, and you and I both hate that.
Yeah, you put it well there, saying bring our knowledge together, because that's one of the reasons we started this podcast. And Kieran and I have been having these conversations for years now, and they're incredibly beneficial to both me as an individual and VO as an organization. So we thought, why not share them with a wider audience and hopefully help educate some of our listeners and ourselves as we continue to dive into various topics over the coming weeks and months.
As opposed to saying we talked to each other for the last 2 years and we've suffered together. Now we want the audience to suffer. We're not saying that, we're bringing value.
Sometimes we suffer together if I don't understand the topic that we're talking about. I think a good place to start here is looking at support itself. What actually is support? And then we can dive into a ROC. So for me, I split it into 3 key pillars. The first one you have is product, and that's the tool utilized to automate the business processes. So this could be AI, OCR, RPA. Let's take RPA for now and use UiPath as an example. The second pillar is process. So the business process that has been automated by, on that example, UiPath as the tool. And this is traditionally what people think of when they think of support, the second pillar, which is process. And then there's a third pillar, which is platform, which is the infrastructure that everything runs on. So depending on your organization and setup, this could be examples like Azure, AWS, or it could be on-prem or in the cloud. Do you agree with that definition, Kieran?
No, I really like that. It's the kind of 3-legged stool that you and I have talked about lots of times, Dan. You know, you need each working really well, otherwise something falls over. From your perspective then, Dan, because you have been doing this support at the billion company level, as well as the hundreds of millions, as well as the millions and the hundreds of thousands, are there any of those from your or a VOps perspective that are actually more important than the other?
Yeah, I'm not going to say any of them aren't important, because what I will, yeah, exactly. You take one down and it will always fall over. But for me, if I looked at, say, if I had just an example of 10 incidents, historically, what I see is the majority will fall into the second 2 pillars, which is process and platform. And the first pillar, which is product, as important as it is, we may receive only 1 out of 10 incidents as anything to do with the product, which is great news for the likes of UiPath and Blue Prism, but it's still very vital to have those relationships with the product.
Dan, how did a ROC come about? Why is it important? What does a ROC even stand for?
For me, a ROC came about, it usually comes about as organization scales within the COE. So it's a function that sits aside as part of the COE. But it comes for two reasons. It comes at scale, and it comes because of skill set. So the first one, scale, around 15, 20 processes. You need a full team in order to keep those processes live and operating. You need a dedicated team. And that comes into the second point, which is skill set. The skill set within a ROC can vary quite differently from that of within the COE. And it usually at that type of scale is not a small team either. So having a dedicated team to focus on that those production live processes is why a ROC is so vital.
Interesting. And do you remember back in the day, people didn't have a COE, and that's a reason why automation ventures failed. Now, as you're describing it, the ROC's a key component to keep alive processes and make sure they actually execute on the value. So how is a ROC actually structured then? How are the teams and the roles in there laid out?
Yeah, so I guess I like splitting everything into three. I'm not going to call these pillars, but let's go with three levels. So standard levels for me would be L1, L2, L3. Now, there are lots of variations of this depending on your organization that you're setting up a ROC for, but I'll go with the most basic one, which is L1 would be a mixture of tooling and a 24/7 offshore, onshore team, whatever that might look like. L2 would be experienced management, both technical and non-technical, with developers and maybe a platform team in there, depending on how that's set up. And then L3 is the service lead or leads. So that is the orchestrator of the ROC. And for me, this is an individual, because all ROCs are set up different. This is an individual who can go into any organization and they can assess the landscape and they can decide where the need is for the client in order to gain the production process success that they are looking for. And that's the main skill set of L3.
Why do you deem a ROC so important? Because you've done this at the 100 million and the couple of $1 billion level. But in essence, why is a ROC there? What's its most key function?
Well, it goes back to what we said before, right? If you have an automation program as a company, to realize that value, you need to keep your processes live and you need to keep them running to realize that value. If you don't have a team dedicated to that, it's very likely that all those things fall at the wayside. And then all the processes that are coming in are not meaningless, but the whole automation program is now at risk, because you're not getting that value you said you would. Your stakeholders are now unhappy, thinking, why are we adding more processes in when the ones we've got running aren't even realizing the value? So I think they're really crucial to the whole program. A ROC is essential towards that. And it was real difficult to actually get organizations to understand that. About a decade ago, it was really just seen as an additional cost and not a necessity. But I think as organizations are now at a reasonable scale, and a lot of them, everyone is, or most organizations are realizing how important this function is.
Yeah, I kind of like that, because back in the day, we didn't realize how important the COE is. And this is the natural extension in my head of a very stable platform and skill set to get people moving and realizing value from automation, which is the absolutely key component. You mentioned earlier on, though, Dan, about, level 1, level 2, level 3. That actually sounds like there's quite interesting career paths for those who work in the ROC. It's not a case of just throwing code across the fence, but you were talking about L1 skill sets. You were talking about infrastructure and environment and some big scale support centers. What are the development pathways for people in a ROC?
Yeah, so I think it's the same issue as before. For me, when I put out a job post, I try and avoid words like support, because people don't really understand the extent of how involved you get in the automation program if you are part of a ROC, support, control tower, whatever we're calling it. But once people, and I've seen this in multiple members of my team, once people actually join the ROC and start getting involved, you realize how many parts of the process lifecycle that you touch. you gain a huge amount of knowledge. You look at best practices, you look at process logging levels, you look at consistent error messages to why processes are breaking. You develop relationship with stakeholders, developers. Like it does encapsulate everything. And sometimes to, I guess, my detriment with the team, you get to realize what area of an automation program you enjoy. And I've lost many individuals who decide to go out and explore those areas in more depth, right? But that does show the opportunities that are there. You get involved in so many different aspects as part of the ROC, and you really develop a knowledge of the industry and how an automation program works. So I think it's great for someone developing or who's already developed and wants to go into that management or lead role.
I love that. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because back in the day, the support role wasn't the one that you wanted to go into because the front end kind of threw code over, made a mess of it, and went, I've done my creative part. What about AI within a ROC, Dan? Because we're hearing about artificial intelligence everywhere. Is it accountable for AI, or is that COE or somewhere else?
100%. And that's back to where I said learning pathways for individuals. That's something my team finds extremely interesting. We've utilized over the last 3 or 4 years a bunch of different monitoring tools that involve AI, not just for monitoring, it's for monitoring, process investigation, and there's a load of them out there. Yeah, I think you could spend months delving into each individual tool, and that's one of the things that's interesting about the team or the team's learning pathways. But we really have started utilizing AI and those monitoring tools a lot over the past 3 or 4 years, and they're incredibly important. I look at L1, I said there's a mixture of 24/7 team and tooling. It used to be the case that if you wanted to monitor processes 24/7, you used to have to just throw individuals at it consistently as you scale. But when the monitoring tools came into place, it meant that now you can have an individual team maybe managing 50 to 100 processes that they're monitoring instead of, say, 20 or 25. So we're seeing the realization of those benefits.
Dan, that sounds like a topic we should have for our next podcast.
Perfect. So that's exactly what we'll talk about. Let's go over quickly what we summarized today, and then what we're going to be talking about next week. So we talked about defining support, what it is, and then what is a ROC, Robotic Operations Center, why a ROC's important, roles within a ROC, and then some of those learning pathways for individuals who might want to join a team like the one we discussed. And then next week, we're going to be discussing AI and RPA. There's a lot of buzz at the moment about AI, and there has been for the last 2 or so years. So we're going to be delving into case studies where the two actually work in parallel rather than being siloed as part of a process.
Fantastic. I can't wait for that one.
Thanks for listening today, everyone, and we will catch you next week.
See you next week.